This is the second video on the weathering of the hull for this model. If you want to see the first stage, watch the previous video in this build series. Now that the rust and salt streaks are completed and sealed in, I can move on to the next phase. That's applying panel line. Panel line represents shadows and dirt and grime. It also is a very good way of bringing out the finer details. It'll help make the model look a lot less flat and plasticky. I find that panel line directly out of the bottle is a bit too heavy, so I like to thin it with 50% solvent. The panel line that I'm using is Mr. Weathering Color Black, and I'm thinning it with Mr. Weathering Color Solvent 110. Applying the panel line is very easy, provided you have done the correct preparation. As an oil-based paint, it's important that you apply it on top of an acrylic varnish. The acrylic varnish will protect the paint below it. If you were to apply an enamel wash on top of an enamel paint, when you tried to remove that enamel wash, you would also remove the paint underneath. I also found that it is better to use a gloss varnish rather than a matte varnish, because the smooth surface of the gloss varnish will assist the panel line with flowing along the creases and the details. The other advantage of a gloss coat is that if you do want to remove panel line, it's far easier to remove it from a gloss surface. With a matte surface, it'll seep in a bit more. You can also get some odd diffusion patterns when you apply a panel line onto a matte surface. So for ease of use and for ease of cleanup, use a gloss varnish. You can always cover it at the end with a matte coat if you want the model to be matte, so there's really no reason to worry about applying a gloss varnish. There are only advantages. Since I'm confident that the excess panel line can be very easily removed, I don't take too much care in how I apply it. I just put it on and make sure that it gets into all of the gaps. As with the rust streaks and salt streaks, once this is all covered with a matte coat, it is going to tone down the intensity of the color, so just bear that in mind. This will be as bright as this is ever going to be. After applying panel line to all the details, I then remove the excess using brushes and earbuds wet with Mr. Weathering Color Solvent 110. At this stage, if there's a mistake that you're going to make, it's going to be that you remove too much panel line. Although I always am very surprised at how even the most minute amount of panel line left on the model still has a good effect, and this can be clearly seen when you compare before and after pictures of a model. So although it may look like in many cases I've removed basically all of the panel line, there actually is still sufficient panel line on the model to create a good effect that helps create more realism in the model. And if at any point I feel like more dirt or grime or panel line or whatever it is needs to be added to the model, it's easy enough to just add it on at a later stage. You can always respray an area with a gloss coat and reapply panel line. Since I also sealed in the rust and salt streaks that I placed onto the deck, I'm also going to apply panel line to the deck area. There are a lot of fine details over here that are actually quite difficult to see without panel line. The panel line is really going to help make them pop out. I use panel line both as a tool for weathering and also to help reveal details that would be otherwise very difficult or impossible to see. After applying panel line to all of the surfaces and cleaning off the excess, it's time to seal it in. I want to seal it in with a matte coat before I move on to highlighting, because for highlighting, my preferred method is to use weathering powders. I find that they are a lot easier to work with for very subtle highlighting. The matte coat that I'm using is Tamiya XF86. As I spray it onto the model, the vibrance of all the colors starts to become dulled down a bit, and the very intense weathering gets subdued, and it creates an effect that I'm far more comfortable with. I don't like the idea of a heavily weathered ship. I like that it's very subtle, and I'm quite happy with the effect that I've achieved with this weathering. I'm spraying it with a matte coat before I apply the highlighter, because as I said, I'm going to be using a powder, and the powder will have a better time sticking to a slightly rough surface. You could apply it to a gloss surface, but then it's more easily going to fall off, and I actually want this powder to stay on the ship. That's the only reason why I'm spraying it with a matte coat. If it wasn't for the powder, then I would just use a gloss coat as well. The powder that I'm using is Tamiya Weathering Master Palette B, and I'm using the snow powder, which is effectively just white. These weathering palettes come with an applicator tool. One end has a very soft brush, and the other end has a foam, almost rubbery applicator. I'm going to be using the soft brush. It'll be able to transfer very small amounts of powder very easily. The stiffer sponge is going to put down way too much. Don't think that it is an appropriate tool to use for this scale. I just want to catch the very edges of very fine details and get a little bit of white on that to make it look like light is hitting it and it's glinting off a corner. It's another one of those things where in the moment it's very hard to see any difference, but when you have a side-by-side comparison of the before and after, it becomes very noticeable. The trick is, as always, subtlety. If you put too much on, it'll look comical, so I tend to err on the side of caution and put on as little as possible. The reason why I like to use a powder is because it is incredibly easy. You can use a dry brush to do this with wet paint, which I suppose is in effect the same process, although you are then trying to get the paint to dry before you brush it onto the model. I say, why bother with going through the drying process? Why don't you just start with a pigment that's already dry? And that's effectively what I'm doing over here. With this technique, if you brush the brush over an area where there isn't any detail for it to get caught on, it's not going to come off, it's not going to make any visual impact. And if you gently just hit a corner or a little bit of raised detail, a very small amount of the pigment will transfer onto the model and you'll get that nice effect. It is just a very easy way of achieving a subtle highlighting effect. And that's how I like to build my models. Find a technique that is simple to use and very repeatable and safe, rather than trying to use some complex and highly skilled method that can very easily go wrong. Perhaps with other techniques for highlighting you can get a better effect, but in my view, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. I think it looks as good as any other method. After applying the powder, I will leave the model. There isn't really a need for me to apply another layer of matte coat at this point. There will be another layer of matte coat at the very end, but this powder, it sticks on very well. It's not going to fall off. I don't have to worry about that. And if some does come off, I don't really mind. It'll just make the effect a little bit more subtle. And as you saw, it's incredibly easy to put it on. So if it does get too toned down, I can always add more on in the future. Since I do know that in the future, there is very likely going to be more rounds of spraying matte coat. And since I don't really need to put it on at this point, I'm just going to leave it as is. In the past 2 videos, I've applied rust streaks, salt streaks, panel line, and now highlighting. So here's a before and after, so that you can judge how the model has changed. Now that the weathering of the hull is completed, I can move on to the last below the deck level installation, and those are the propellers. I intentionally had not installed the propellers up until this point, because the propellers are going to be painted in metallic paint, and metallic paint doesn't look as good after you've covered it with a matte coat or a gloss coat, so I prefer to leave it off and treat them separately. After all, they are just propellers, so the installation won't be particularly complicated. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.